If you follow musical theater at all, you are probably aware of the fact that there are currently two competing Great Gatsby musicals running at the moment. Entirely separate adaptations of the classic novel with entirely separate creative teams and entirely separate casts. Now, why is this happening? Because The Great Gatsby went into public domain and two entirely separate groups of people decided to, because they no longer had to pay for the rights to it, write musicals based on it. And because of just, how long it takes to adapt something into a musical, they both ended up taking roughly the same amount of time to be written and then put on somewhere. One of them is currently running on Broadway, which originally had an out-of-town tryout at Paper Mill Playhouse, and the other is currently running at ART, a regional theater, in a pre-Broadway tryout. I have seen them both, and I'm going to do my best to describe them both to you, similarities, differences, how they each approach the material, and going in depth as to different aspects of the production, the cast, the set, the lighting, all of it. And before we get any further, I'm just going to, for the sake of simplicity, refer to these two musicals as the Paper Mill Great Gatsby and the ART Gatsby for the rest of the video, because that is just easier than referring to one as the Great Gatsby and one as Gatsby. And I also want to add one other caveat into this before I get into discussing the actual musicals, in that these two musicals are in different stages right now. The Paper Mill Great Gatsby is currently on Broadway. It is a finished product. It is not going to be changed any further from what it currently is. It is a done piece of art. That is not true for the ART Gatsby, which is still in an out-of-town tryout. How musicals are developed is very often they have out-of-town tryouts, and then they come to Broadway, and they will change very often a significant amount between that point and the final opening day on Broadway. They will change throughout the out-of-town tryout, they will change in Broadway previews, and then stop when the press starts coming in. Paper Mill Great Gatsby is done, ART Gatsby is not done. So I'm going to be judging both of them based on where they are in development. Is that an unfair comparison? Yes it is. I'm going to do my best to try and make it fair with how I discuss them, and adding in caveats when I discuss any flaws in the ART Gatsby with it's not done. I'm not going to add those same caveats to when I discuss the Paper Mill Great Gatsby, because it is done. I should also note regarding ART as an unfinished production that I have heard they've made changes to the show since I saw it. I've heard there's an entirely new song in the show since I saw it that I obviously have no knowledge of. Do keep in mind that ART Gatsby is still very much a work in progress. I know they are actively changing the show from night to night. I will have in the description what night I saw ART, so you will know if something has changed since then I have not seen it. Alright, with that, let's move on to discussing the two Great Gatsby musicals. The first thing I would say is that these are two entirely different adaptations. Yes, they both are based on the same novel, they both have basically the same plot, because neither of them took massive plot changes to The Great Gatsby. Yes, there are liberties. Both adaptations of The Great Gatsby take liberties from the source material. Neither are 100% book accurate, but the plot is basically the same in both of them. And I should also note spoilers for The Great Gatsby as a plot and for each of the two productions from this point forward. There's really no way for me to compare these two productions without getting into spoilers for how they approach the material, as well as, of course, the material itself. The Paper Mill Great Gatsby, to start with, approaches the show as this grand doomed romance. That is how it chooses to approach the material. And that is what it prioritizes from the novel. It prioritizes the romance between Daisy and Gatsby above everything else in the novel. It also adds a significant level of focus to a romance between Nick and Jordan as well. Romance is what this is going for. This is trying to be a big Broadway spectacle, and it's largely successful at that. The set is incredible. I will get more into the set in that section of the video. In short, it is a very literal set in terms of it is literally depicting every single thing from the novel, and it's massive. Both of these are massive, but the Paper Mill Great Gatsby is big. It's a big show. And where this show chooses to focus much of its runtime is discussing the romance, the doomed romance between Daisy and Gatsby. It has a largely typical 1920s aesthetic in terms of the set, the costumes, everything in the show. And again, priority is given to Daisy and Gatsby as characters over basically everyone else. Nick is significantly smaller in this adaptation than in the novel. He's not as much our narrator in this as he is in the novel. Myrtle and Wilson are side characters. Jordan is a bit expanded in this. Notably, this Great Gatsby does flesh out the female characters more than what is in the novel, which was an intentional choice. I had the opportunity to go to a discussion with the book writer of this Gatsby. I had an opportunity to go to a discussion with the book writer of this production production of Great Gatsby, who very much discussed the intentional choices of making this more of a female look at the Great Gatsby. And you can feel that in this in terms of how they flesh out the characters, particularly of Daisy and Jordan. But again, romance takes priority here over any other themes present in the novel. The ART Gatsby musical, on the other hand, prioritizes the social messaging from the novel and those themes more than anything else. It is less focused on the romance. Don't get me wrong, the romance is definitely still present for Daisy and Gatsby. Not at all Nick and Jordan. I'll get to that when I get into cast and characters, because in this adaptation, Nick especially, but also Jordan to a lesser extent, are explicitly gay. So obviously there's no romance between them. The green light is a major factor in this musical as representing the American dream, what the characters want, more so than it was in the Paper Mill Gatsby. The green light is essentially always on the stage. There is a recurring lyric throughout the show said by various characters of reaching for the light. And you may be asking, how do you remember this kind of details from Gatsby at ART given that no material has been released? Well, I took notes because I knew I was going to be doing this video. Once again, I'm going to discuss the set more specifically when we get into the physical production section of the video. However, I will briefly mention this is a less literal interpretation of Great Gatsby in terms of scenic design. The main set is an automobile yard and made of various different broken pieces of cars. Period-specific cars, I should also mention. It's 1920s. And there are set pieces that are more literal that reveal themselves throughout the show of various locations. Gatsby's mansion, Tom and Daisy's mansion, Myrtle and Wilson's house. Again, I will get more into that in the physical production section of the video. This is just to say shortly, it is a less literal interpretation in terms of scenic design and physical production than the Paper Mill Great Gatsby. The last thing I would say for the general approach to ART Gatsby is it's very thematically Hadestown. If you've seen Hadestown, thematically this show very much feels like a spiritual successor to it, which it's by the same director, Rachel Chapkin. You can absolutely feel her influence in this musical. All right, now let's dive a bit into specific aspects of the show. So first, let's dive into the score of each version. Paper Mill Great Gatsby's music is very much in the modern musical theater style, if you know what I mean, with very jazzy orchestrations to make it feel more of the time period. The songs are very much crafted to be very catchy, to go viral on TikTok, and several of them have gone viral on TikTok. And they're also very much designed to play to the strengths of the cast. They know they have two Broadway icons in Jeremy Jordan and Eva Noblezada in the cast, and the score is very much designed to highlight the two of them and give them chances to belt. The score is music by Jason Howland and lyrics by Nathan Tyson. Jason Howland in particular is most famous for doing orchestrations and arrangements for various Broadway musicals. He did the orchestrations for Shucked. He also wrote the music for most recently Paradise Square on Broadway. If you've heard that music, there is not a cast album because of things that happened with Paradise Square, but if you've heard that music, that is similar in style to what this show is, although a bit more jazzy with the orchestrations. There are several songs out for The Great Gatsby that they've released on social media that are on morning shows. There's a cast album coming out fairly soon if you want to get a feel for what the music is. Now, moving on to the ART production of Great Gatsby, the music is largely the claim to fame for this production because the music is written by Florence Welch of Florence and the Machine fame, as well as Thomas Bartlett. And the music, for the most part, very much sounds Florence and the Machine. The orchestrations for the show feel very Hadestown in style. There's a lot of horns to them, but the music by and large feels very Florence and the Machine. If you like Florence and the Machine, you will probably love the music in this. And it plays more around with genre. It is not just one genre of music for the entirety of the show. There's some rock in here, there's some folk in here. There's one song when I saw it that was more classic Broadway. There was some tap in that classic Broadway song. There is not one genre here that is overwhelming, but if you have heard Florence and the Machine music, you have a feel for what the music sounds like from this. There is no music that is publicly released from this production. I wish there was. I would love to listen to it again. And note, that is not a comment against the Paper Mill Gatsby. I've heard the party song 5 million times from Paper Mill Gatsby. With ART Gatsby, there are songs I would love to listen to again that I cannot. Imagine Florence and the Machine music with the orchestrations of Hadestown. That is what you have for ART Gatsby's score. Neither shows are sung through, both are traditional book musicals. Now, moving on from score to discussing the casts of both productions. And before I get into the casts of both productions, I want to highlight a difference between the two in terms of casting that is important to note before we get into discussions. The Paper Mill Great Gatsby cast everyone racially blind. The ART production of Gatsby is color-conscious cast. Everyone is playing their actual real-life racial ethnicity. Characters are explicitly white, and it matters for the story that they are played by someone white or not white. Race This is immaterial to the casting of Paper Mill Great Gatsby in a way it just is not at all to the casting of the ART production of Great Gatsby. Now, let's discuss the Paper Mill Great Gatsby cast. They're universally great. They've cast some really great currently working musical theater actors. Jeremy Jordan is a very funnily insecure Great Gatsby. Once again, from having had the opportunity to go to that event with the book writer of Paper Mill Great Gatsby, I know they attempted to portray him as having some sort of undiagnosed neurodivergence, and you can feel that in the show. And again, that's coming from the book writer Kate Kerrigan and how she chose to write Great Gatsby in this adaptation of the musical. Eva Noblezada plays the all-too-aware Daisy that is very empty, as you end up finding out very well. I will also note that at the performance I saw of The Great Gatsby, Samantha Pauly was out, so I did not see her and I cannot judge her performance, but her understudy for Jordan Baker was great, and I will make a note of that she was great. Jordan Baker is very much portrayed as being a modern woman, much more progressive than Daisy. There's a dynamic going on between the two of them in the show. I'd also like to really highlight the ensemble for the Paper Mill Great Gatsby. This is the one that's currently on Broadway, because they are really, really great. There's a lot of dancing in this. Once again, it's a very big, showy musical, and they do great at all of the big production numbers. Moving on to the cast of the ART production of Great Gatsby, this cast is also pretty universally great. Both productions of The Great Gatsby are cast very well. There's just not as much name recognition behind the people in the ART production of Great Gatsby. But that is not a comment on talent. They are all equally as talented. I would also make a note in this one that the highlight of the ART production of Great Gatsby's cast is absolutely Saleha Pfeiffer. She plays Myrtle, whose role is greatly expanded in the ART production of Great Gatsby. The ART production of Great Gatsby very much creates an intentional parallel between Myrtle and Daisy, leading to Myrtle's role being fleshed out significantly more than it was in the book, in a way that I really like and builds on a lot of the pre-existing themes in the book. She has some of the best songs in the show, a lot of the best acting moments. She is by far the highlight of this cast. Ben Levi Ross is an interesting Nick because you feel his presence a lot. ART Gatsby very much brings Nick back into the narrator seat in a way much more than Paper Mill Gatsby does. You always notice him watching everything. The use of perspective in the ART Gatsby is a major thing. This is a side from the cast conversation, but you very much can tell whose perspective you're supposed to be watching each scene from. And for most of the show, that is Nick. It's not always Nick. There's a scene that is from Jordan's perspective, played wonderfully by Ellery Ward, which I should also note, Jordan in this production is a much smaller part, but Ellery Ward is absolutely a scene stealer in the moments that she does have. It's a small part. And there's several scenes which we're supposed to be viewing from the lens of the ensemble, who in the ART production is supposed to represent the working class for most of the scenes that they're in. I would also like to highlight Charlotte McInnes within this production, who plays Daisy. They're a relative unknown, and they have made a very, very strong stage debut in America. She has a lot of strong moments both on her own and up against Tom. I'd also like to highlight Matthew O'Meara, who plays Wilson in this production, especially because in this, the character of Wilson is a baritone, which I always appreciate. I feel like practically all modern musical theater male roles are tenors, and I appreciate seeing a very well-written baritone part. And lastly, we get into Isaac Powell's Gatsby, who I should note is a much smaller character in this version of Great Gatsby than the Paper Mill version of Gatsby. He doesn't show up until roughly halfway through Act 1. He's a much more minor character in this, similar to how he is in the book. He's a Gatsby who is felt more than seen, if that makes sense. Who you can always feel how much he is longing for Daisy and just being accepted by the society that surrounds him and that he surrounds himself in. Now let's get into the physical productions of both adaptations of The Great Gatsby. Things like set, lighting design, costumes, choreography. Once again, the Paper Mill production of Great Gatsby, the one currently on Broadway, is a very literal adaptation. It very much plays into a typical 1920s aesthetic for how it approaches costume design, scenic design, lighting design, everything. And it's very impressive. It is a big show. It uses screens. It is probably the single most effective use of screens that I've ever seen on Broadway. They blend pretty seamlessly into the more physical scenic design elements. Very often when I find theatrical productions utilizing screens, it feels cheap. That is not something I felt here at all. This is a show where you can feel your money on stage. That, Broadway shows are expensive. You can feel the amount of money that you spent on a ticket on the stage for this show in terms of how it approaches scenic design. There's massive sets, there's full cars, there's pyrotechnics in one scene for this show. It's big. It is a big show. The costumes are typical flapper dresses. They're big, they're shiny, they're glittery. The choreography is big and showy. The ART production of Gatsby, on the other hand, is equally big. They are both very big, spectacle-driven musicals, but is not literal at all. Once again, the primary set for the ART production of Great Gatsby is essentially an abandoned auto yard filled with a bunch of broken auto parts. There are no images that I can show you of the ART production of Great Gatsby, so I have to describe it the best that I can. The set is a series of spiral staircases made up of auto parts. That is what the base set is. That's what you walk into the theater and see. But there are more set pieces. There are set pieces that reveal themselves to be Gatsby's mansion that are much more traditional 1920s aesthetic, that reveal themselves from within those car parts. Myrtle and Wilson's house is a whole elaborate set piece that comes on and off the stage from this. I would also note that during the current production at ART, they are having some set issues, so some of the set pieces that are supposed to be a part of the final production assumably will be there should this production transfer to Broadway in the future. At the moment, as of me recording this video, there are no announced plans to transfer this production to Broadway, but just given who's behind it, I think we all know that that is the intention behind this production, to bring it to Broadway someday. It has Broadway producers behind it. Just look at the creative team. They want to bring this show to Broadway. I don't think I am jumping too far here to say that this show wants to end up on Broadway someday. Should this show end up on Broadway, it will be an even more elaborate set piece because they will assumably fix the pieces that don't work here. Referring back to my notes that I took of the pre-show speech for this show, they specifically told us that the sets for the apartment and the hotel room were not going to work for this particular show that I saw, and you could definitely tell those set pieces were nowhere near as impressive as the rest of the set pieces for it. They basically just rolled out chairs and couches and such onto the stage, onto the base automobile stage. So I can't judge what the set pieces are supposed to look like, and I really don't feel fair judging what they ended up looking like either, because I know it is not what was planned. It's technical difficulties, and I saw the show knowingly when it wasn't done. And so that is something that I have to be forgiving of. Once again, mentioning I'm judging these shows based on where they are. Paper Mill as a finished product and ART as an incomplete product. I would also note that I have heard the lighting design was not done for the performance that I saw, so I'm not going to comment on the lighting design at all, with the exception to say the moments that felt more finished were very impressive and used light very intentionally, especially color. I would also note for costume design of Great Gatsby, the costume design very much played into the deeper meanings of the piece. Yes, a lot of the costumes feel very 1920s. There are flapper dresses, there's suits that are very much time period, but they are also not as showy as the Paper Mill production. The ensemble is not, for most scenes, wearing the very elaborate, rich costumes of the 1920s. For the most part, the ensemble is representing the working class, and they're wearing jumpsuits, auto worker suits, maid outfits. I would also note that the costume design is very intentional in its usage of color. Everyone, except for Gatsby and Daisy in one scene, is only wearing blacks, whites, and grays. The rich characters wearing whites, the poorer characters wearing blacks and grays, Nick being somewhere in between. Gatsby, meanwhile, being in a bright pink suit for most of the show. He's the only one who gets to wear color. I would also note that every character has dirt on their costumes, some sort of rusty dirt thing, usually along the bottom of their pants, skirt, dress, whatever they're wearing on the bottom of their costume. The only person who I never noticed dirt on was Gatsby, and I also don't believe I ever saw dirt on Jordan. This is also a very big physical production. It is just not as much of a literal physical production, more of a thematic physical production. If you saw the most recent revival of Sweeney Todd, which is by the same scenic designer, you will know what I mean, that they aren't literally depicting all of the various locations in London in that, but it's still nonetheless a very big set with a lot of elaborate moving parts. So now let's get into an overall comparison of the two of them now that we've discussed individual pieces at length. Overall, what I would say about these two productions, because I know people are going to want me to say this one is great and this one is terrible, and I'm not going to do that. I think that these are two interpretations of The Great Gatsby that are trying to do entirely separate things. One is trying to be this epic romantic spectacle, and one is trying to dive into the rich political and class subtext of the novel. And I think both, for where they are in development, are fairly effective at what they are trying to do. The Paper Mill Great Gatsby is a production that knows what it is and does it, and that is something I always respect from a production, even if I might not individually agree with all of the choices that they made, in terms of what to prioritize and what not to prioritize within the novel. This is a show that knows what it's trying to be, knows what it wants to do, and knows how to sell itself, and that is something that I can respect. And those songs are very catchy. They are very catchy. And the ART Gatsby, at this point, is not a perfect musical. I don't want to pretend that it's a perfect musical because it's not. There are absolutely flaws with it. I do think the flaws are fixable. Again, it is early in development. It's still in the middle of an out-of-town tryout where they're actively adding and removing songs on a nightly basis. But it is also a show that knows what it is and is doing it fairly effectively. It's just doing something entirely different than what the Paper Mill Gatsby is. I think both shows have their own merit to them, but I think you have to approach both of them on their own terms. Neither of the shows is 100% accurate to the novel, which I don't think it would be possible to do an adaptation of The Great Gatsby that would fully work if it was 100% accurate to the novel. For one reason being Nick's narration. ART definitely leans more into Nick as being your perspective on the show, but they don't 100% lean into that, and I think that that's a smart choice because I think shows that lean into a character that is more supposed to be your perspective than being an actual character don't largely work within the medium of musical theater. I think that that was a problem with, I would relate it to Almost Famous, the musical. And that one of the flaws of that musical is that they didn't know how to approach the character of William, because the character of William is supposed to be more an observer than a character. And how do you make that character sing? Because he's more the person watching everyone else sing. That is very much the character of Nick. And so I think that both productions kind of had to figure out a problem with Nick. Paper Mill chose to make Nick a very different character and lessen his role of narration. ART chose to keep Nick more in the narrator seat, but in a way that is still less than the novel. And both choose to focus or not focus on different characters. Paper Mill chooses to focus more on Jordan. ART chooses to focus more on Myrtle. They are two musicals that are trying to do different things. If you are looking for a show that is a grand romantic spectacle where you don't even really need to know much about The Great Gatsby, then I would direct you to the Paper Mill production that is currently playing on Broadway. It is a show that I have largely started recommending to people as a general Broadway recommendation because it's a fairly safe recommendation. It is a big Broadway spectacle. It's a romance. It's family friendly. It is something I know if you are looking for Broadway, it feels Broadway with a capital B, if that makes sense. The ART production, though, is more leaning into the class and political subtext of the novel, and if you are looking for that in a show that is more thematically in line with those elements of The Great Gatsby, I would direct you to the ART production, which I would also note is significantly more adult in terms of how it approaches the subject matter than the Paper Mill production. The Paper Mill production is fairly family-friendly. The ART production is definitely more adult, more along the lines of, let's say, a Moulin Rouge in terms of content. Again, I think both are solid at what they are trying to do. They are just trying to do different things. Personally, I did prefer what ART was trying to do. I don't think they're fully 100% there yet in terms of what they're trying to do. But if they get to what they are trying to do, what I think they are trying to do, that is closer to what my own personal interpretation of The Great Gatsby is. Again, these are two very different interpretations of the same source material that, while they may share the same plot, have very different approaches to it and what they choose to focus on and what they choose to ignore and how they choose to approach the significant metaphors from the piece. The green light is approached very differently in both musicals. The billboard is not even present in the ART production of Gatsby. The genres of music are entirely different between the two productions. Despite being based on the same novel, these feel like two entirely separate musicals, which they are. And I don't think it's as easy as saying, this is the Great Gatsby and this is the Good Gatsby. At least not at the present moment. Both have their strengths, both have their flaws. I think both are going to appeal to different sets of people because both were really created for different target audiences. And I think both productions know that. Both productions seemed to have a very strong sense of who they were written for. which once again is something that I always respect in a musical that knows its audience. Look at how long this video is, and I have just about scratched the surface in terms of the parallels and differences between these two musicals. They are very different beasts. Personally, I'm honestly really glad that I saw both adaptations of The Great Gatsby, because they are both very different interpretations of source material that I love. And I found it really interesting to see the things that both productions decided to do the same and the things that both productions decided to do differently. Like the fact that both adaptations put the act break, the break between Act 1 and Act 2, in the exact same place. Or the moments that one chose to give characters songs and the other chose to not give characters songs. I honestly think it's very interesting, and I appreciate having two entirely different musicals added to the musical theater canon based on this novel.